Evelyn Hartwell slammed her hand flat on the manuscript. The crack echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Every scholar in the room froze. "Read it yourself," she said, her voice dead calm. "Or step aside and let someone who actually can." The Duke of Whitmore stared at her. 40 years old. 6 feet of English arrogance. He had just told an entire room full of royal scholars that she couldn't read Latin. He had said it like she wasn't standing right there. She picked up the pen, and she began. "If this story already has your blood up, subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Evelyn's story travels." The morning her father died, Evelyn Hartwell sold his books. Not because she wanted to, because the landlord was coming at noon and the rent was 3 months gone, and there was nothing left in the house worth more than paper and ink. She carried the boxes out herself, stacking them on the porch of their Virginia home while the winter sun came up cold and pale over the hills. And she did not cry. She had already done that. She had done it the night before. Alone in the hallway outside his room, pressing her fist against her mouth so he wouldn't hear her through the wall. He died at 6 in the morning, quietly, the way he had done most things. She kept 3 books, just 3 out of hundreds. A battered Virgil, a Roman military text with water-damaged pages and his handwriting cramping every margin. And a small notebook, his own hand, full of translations he had never finished. The last entry, written in pencil so faint she had to tilt it toward the light to read. "There is a Latin that the textbooks do not teach. It is the Latin of men who knew they were going to die. If you ever find it, Evelyn, do not translate it like a scholar. Translate it like a human being." She closed the notebook. She packed it at the bottom of her case under her 2 good dresses and her ink supply. 3 weeks later, she was on a ship to London. She arrived with $11. A letter of introduction, and no illusions. The position was copying assistant to the Royal Historical Society, which meant she sat in a small room on the ground floor of a building on Whitehall and copied whatever the senior scholars produced. By hand, precisely, without comment. Mr. Perkins, the administrator who showed her to her desk on the first morning, made the rules very clear. He said, "Do not interpret. Do not annotate." "Understood," she said. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at her, traveling from her worn hem to her ink-stained fingers to her face, trying to determine where exactly she fit in the order of things. He clearly couldn't figure it out. He left without another word. She sat down, she picked up the first document, she began to read. And within 3 sentences she found the error. It was a translation of a Roman administrative text, credited to Dr. Fairfax, a name she would come to know well. A name that appeared on everything in the building, like a stamp of ownership. The document was labeled as a grain distribution record from the 2nd century. But the Latin in the 3rd paragraph was not talking about grain. The verb forms were wrong for commodities. The sentence structure was wrong. The subject of every clause was human. It was a casualty record. A list of men who hadn't come home. She set down her pen. She sat very still. She thought about what to do. Then she picked the pen back up, copied the document precisely as instructed, and at the bottom added 1 line in her smallest handwriting. Note, paragraph 3 appears to reference a casualty record, not grain distribution. She folded it. She delivered it upstairs. No one acknowledged it. She did it again the following week. And the week after that. By the end of her 2nd month, she had quietly corrected 11 of Fairfax's translations. Not 1 correction had been credited. Not 1 had even been discussed with her. The errors were simply fixed in the next version, under Fairfax's name, as if they had never existed. She kept coming back. Because the work itself, the untangling of old words from old silence, was the only thing that made her feel close to him. To her father. To his voice across the breakfast table, reading Virgil in the Virginia mornings, while the light came through the window and the world was still something she understood. She kept her head down. She kept her mouth shut. Until the morning of December the 15th, when she stopped. She heard the name first. moving through the building like a weather change. Duke Whitmore is coming. This morning, he's bringing the manuscript. The Dunmore find. She looked up from her desk. What manuscript? Perkins appeared in her doorway, already irritated. The Dunmore manuscript, discovered beneath the east wing of Whitmore Estate last month during renovations. Roman era, possibly 2nd or 3rd century. He paused. It is a significant occasion, Miss Hartwell. I suggest you focus on your copying and leave the occasion to those qualified to manage it. Of course, she said. She turned back to her desk, but she listened. He arrived at 10:30. And she felt it before she heard it, the shift in the building's atmosphere. The collective straightening of spines, the specific hush that falls when someone with real power walks through a door. His voice was low and clear and didn't need to try. I want a translation, not an assessment, not a preliminary review. A translation. Who is your best man, doctor? Fairfax is our preeminent. Perkins from the hallway. Then get him in the room. She kept her eyes on her work. She heard footsteps, doors, the low murmur of important men gathering around something important. Then she heard Fairfax's voice, round and authoritative. Remarkable condition for its age. The vellum suggesting you read it? The Duke. Flat. We are in the process of assessment. That's not what I asked. Can you read it? Silence. She knew that silence. She had heard it in universities, in lecture halls. In the spaces between men who had spent so long performing expertise that they had forgotten what actual understanding felt like. The script is unusual, another voice offered carefully. The letter forms, I didn't ask about the letter forms, more silence. She stood up. She was not entirely sure what moved her. Her father's voice, maybe. Or simple exhaustion, 2 months of sitting on the other side of walls while men got things wrong. She stood up and she opened the door, and she walked into the hall. The great hall of the Historical Society was long and paneled in dark wood, with high windows that let in gray winter light. The manuscript lay on the central table in a flat wooden case lined with velvet. And she could see it from the doorway, 12 inches of closely written Latin. The ink faded to the color of old blood, the letters cramped and slanted in a way that stopped her breath. She had seen that hand before. Not this document, but this style. This specific compression of letters, this particular shorthand. This way of running words together when the writer was moving fast or scared or both. Her father had shown it to her, years ago, in the water-damaged military text she still kept on her windowsill. Western Provincial Latin, he had said. 3rd century. The soldiers who wrote this were far from Rome and they knew it. They wrote fast, they wrote scared. Most scholars never learn to read it because most scholars never bother to understand why it exists. She was so focused on the manuscript that she almost didn't notice the Duke noticing her. Perkins, his voice changed register, lower, quieter. Not angry. Just precise that. She looked up. Duke Alexander Whitmore was 36 years old and built like someone who had spent real time in the field, not the drawing room version of military service, but the actual thing, the kind that left marks. Broad through the shoulder, straight in the spine, with a face that had been arranged by experience into something harder and more specific than handsomeness. Dark eyes that moved through a room the way a surveyor moves through territory cataloging. Measuring, assessing threat and value simultaneously. Those eyes landed on her and stayed. That is our copying assistant, Perkins said, his voice already carrying the tone of an apology. Miss Hartwell. She was American, the Duke said. Yes, Your Grace. He looked at her for one more second. Then he looked away, back to the manuscript, dismissing her as smoothly and completely as if she had ceased to exist. She felt it. She felt the specific quality of that dismissal, not cruel. Which would have been easier to answer. Just absolute. She simply did not register as relevant. She stood in the doorway. Fairfax was bending over the case now, his face close to the manuscript. His expression the concentrated frown of a man performing intelligence for an audience. Around him 3 other senior scholars leaned in. each of them doing the same thing, performing, processing. Waiting for someone else to go first. The syntax is irregular, one of them murmured. Possibly corrupted in transmission, or a regional dialect variant.
If we had more time to conduct a proper.
You have had 3 weeks, the Duke said. And his voice was still pleasant, which made it worse. The estate's archivist sent preliminary photographs 3 weeks ago. Are you telling me that in 3 weeks, none of you have been able to produce even a partial reading? Silence. Because I have a meeting with the Lord Chancellor in 4 days, he continued. And the contents of that document may have direct bearing on a property claim that has been contested for 40 years. So I am going to ask one more time. He looked around the room. Can any of you read it? Evelyn walked to the table. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at Fairfax or Perkins or any of the scholars arranged around the velvet case. She looked only at the manuscript, and she leaned forward. And she read. The Duke's voice came from across the table. Perfectly even, she can't read Latin, not to her. Not a question directed at her. A statement made about her. To the room, the way you might note that a piece of furniture had been moved to an inconvenient location. She heard the collective exhale from the scholars, the soft, grateful release of men who had been rescued from an awkward situation by someone else's authority. She heard it. She registered it. She filed it somewhere very deep and very still. She looked at the manuscript, and she read the first line. She stopped, because she knew that phrase. She had heard it before in a cold Virginia bedroom. From a dying man's lips, my brother, her throat closed. She did not allow it to reach her face. She breathed once, through her nose, and she continued. Psi haec verba legis. Noli flarer. Noli medullare quod ego facere non potui. She straightened up. The room was absolutely silent. She looked at the table. Not at any face in the room, and she translated, My brother. If you are reading these words, I have already fallen. Do not weep for me, do not grieve for me, do what I was unable to do. Nothing moved. She looked up, not at the Duke, at Fairfax. This is not a military order, she said. Her voice was steady. She had spent a long time learning to keep it steady. It is not an administrative record. It is not strategic correspondence. She paused. It is a letter. A Roman commander writing to his brother the night before his final battle. He knew he wasn't coming back. He was writing his goodbye. Fairfax's face was doing something complicated, cycling through disbelief. Affront, and the specific humiliation of a man watching someone else do the thing he was supposed to be able to do. That is a remarkable interpretation, he said carefully. But without a full assessment of the linguistic. It isn't an interpretation, she looked at him directly. It's a translation. There is a difference, his mouth closed. The Duke spoke. Continue. She turned back to the manuscript. It took 40 minutes. She worked through the document section by section, pausing to explain her reasoning aloud, not for the scholars, who had stopped attempting to follow her and were now simply watching, but because that was how her father had taught her. Say the thinking out loud, he had told her. The thinking is the work. The translation is just the record of the thinking. She identified 3 separate hands in the document. The commander's letter, a marginal note added by a courier, and a final line written at the very bottom in a third. Different script cramped into the last remaining space on the vellum. The writing of someone who had very little room left and a great deal to say. When she reached it, she slowed down. She had known it was there since the second page. She had been working toward it the way you work toward something you aren't sure you're ready to face. The Duke's voice came from across the table, quieter than before. The last line. What does it say? She looked at it. Memini frater, nomen tuum non obliviscar. She had known what it said. She had known since she first saw the shape of the letters. She had saved it for last because she had needed the 40 minutes to be ready to say it in a room full of strangers without her voice breaking. She looked up. I remember, brother, she said, do not be afraid. I will not forget your name. The hall was completely silent. Outside, London kept moving carriages, footsteps, the distant sound of the river. In here, there was nothing but the manuscript and 12 men who had come in expecting one kind of morning and were now standing inside a completely different one. It was Fairfax who broke first. This he stopped. Restarted. The letter forms alone further verification before we can accept a reading as Fairfax. The Duke's voice was quiet and final. Stop, Fairfax, stop. The Duke looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name, not contempt, which had burned off somewhere around the second page. Not the polite interest of a man being gracious to someone who had surprised him. Something more careful than that. Something that was working very hard to stay calibrated. The property claim I mentioned, he said. The Lord Chancellor's meeting. The reason this document matters, he paused. Does the content of this manuscript support or contradict a 40-year land dispute involving the Whitmore estate? She held his gaze. I'll need to examine the remaining documents before I can answer that. How long? A week. He nodded at once. He looked at Perkins. Miss Hartwell is reassigned, effective immediately. She works on the Dunmore collection directly, under my oversight. Full access, appropriate compensation. He picked up his coat from the chair back. Appropriate credit. Fairfax's head came up sharply. Your Grace, with respect. You had 3 weeks in a room full of scholars, the Duke said without looking at him. She had 40 minutes. The mathematics are fairly clear. He buttoned his coat. Miss Hartwell, Your Grace, Whitmore House, tomorrow. 8 o'clock. His eyes met hers one last time. Don't be late. I never am. He left. The room was quiet for 10 full seconds. Then Perkins exhaled a long, exhausted sound, like a man who had just watched a carriage accident from a window and looked at her. Well, he said. Well, she said. She walked back to the copying room. She sat down at her desk. She looked at the 3 books on her windowsill. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking for some time. She thought. She had simply refused to let them show. She pressed her palms flat against the desk and breathed. I will not forget your name. She had walked into that room because she was exhausted by walls. By sitting behind them, listening through them, being confined by them. She had walked in because 2 months of quiet competence had produced exactly nothing, and she was done being quiet. She had not expected the manuscript to reach back. She had not expected a dead man's letter to say in cramped 3rd century Latin the same thing her father had been trying to say on the morning he died. She pressed her hands flat until the shaking stopped. Then she opened her father's notebook. She read his last unfinished translation, the fragment he had been working on, when his hands became too weak to hold a pen. The ones who are forgotten are not truly lost. They live in the space between words. In the silence at the edge of every sentence. They wait for someone with ears enough to hear them. She closed the notebook. She picked up her pen. She still had copying to finish. She worked until the light was gone, across the city. In the upper library of Whitmore House, Alexander Whitmore stood at the window with a glass of brandy he hadn't touched and thought about a woman in a faded blue dress. He had dismissed 1,000 people in rooms like that one. Scholars, archivists, titled men with expensive educations and nothing useful behind them. He had learned to read competence the way other men read faces quickly. Accurately, without sentiment. He was almost never wrong. He had been wrong about her in 60 seconds. He had said 4 words she can't read Latin, and within the length of a single paragraph she had made those 4 words the most expensive mistake he had made in recent memory. That wasn't what was bothering him. What was bothering him was the way she had read the last line. He had watched her slow down. He had watched something move across her face fast. Controlled, gone in a breath. He was good at reading people. He had spent years in situations where misreading someone cost lives. He knew the difference between a person performing emotion and a person actually having it and choosing to contain it. She had been containing something real. I will not forget your name. He turned away from the window. He crossed to his desk. He opened the case containing the remaining Dunmore documents, page after page of cramped, faded Latin that his scholars had declared unreadable, and he sat down and he looked at them in the lamplight. He thought, she's not here for the money. The position pays almost nothing, and she took it anyway. She's not here for the status, she's American. She has no social stake in English academic prestige. He thought, she's here because she cares what the words mean. He thought, I can't remember the last time I met someone in this city who cared about the actual thing, rather than what the thing could get them. He closed the document case. He reached for the brandy. He put it down again without drinking it. Tomorrow. 8 o'clock. He had a great many questions. And for the first time in longer than he could easily recall, he was genuinely uncertain what the answers were going to be. He blew out the lamp. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about a woman who had walked into a room full of powerful men and not asked any of them for permission. He thought, whatever she's looking for in those documents, it's the same thing I am. He thought, I just don't know yet if that makes us allies or something more complicated than that. Sleep, when it came, was a long time coming. She arrived at Whitmore House at 7:58. Not because she was eager, because she had learned, a long time ago, that the only power a woman in her position actually controlled was time. She could not control who listened to her. She could not control who credited her. She could not control the way a room full of men looked at her when she walked through a door. But she could control whether she was late, and she had decided, somewhere on the cold walk across the city that morning, that Alexander Whitmore was not a man she intended to give any advantage to. The butler showed her to a room at the back of the house, not the main library, she noted, but a smaller working room, lined with shelves, lit by 2 tall windows. A long table ran down the center of it, and on the table, laid out in careful order, were the remaining Dunmore documents. 14 separate pieces of vellum, 3 fragments, 1 partial scroll. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. You're early. The Duke was behind her, coming from a side door, still pulling on his jacket. His hair was slightly less arranged than it had been yesterday. He looked like a man who had been up for hours and had decided that was simply the condition he lived in. 2 minutes, she said. I said 8 o'clock. It is 8 o'clock. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked past her to the head of the table. Sit down. Miss Hartwell. Across the table from him. Not at the far end, not tucked into a corner, directly across, so they were level. She watched him notice it. She watched him decide not to comment. The property claim, she said. Tell me exactly what you're looking for. He looked up from the documents. I'll tell you what I know. You tell me what the documents say. We don't mix the two. Why not? Because I don't want your translation shaped by what I hope to find. She considered that. It was, she had to admit, a more sophisticated concern than she had expected from him. All right, she said. Show me where you want me to start. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. He sat at the other end of the table and worked too, going through correspondence, writing notes, occasionally asking her a question that she answered without looking up. They didn't talk beyond that. They didn't need to. The room had the particular quality of 2 people who were each very good at something, occupying the same space and getting out of each other's way. At noon, a servant brought tea. She drank hers without noticing it getting cold. At noon, she found the second letter. She almost missed it. It was tucked inside a larger administrative document, folded into a quarter of its original size, the creases so old that they had become structural part of the vellum itself. Almost the document folded into itself for so long that it had forgotten how to be flat. She unfolded it carefully, millimeter by millimeter, and when she had it open on the table, she stared at it for a long moment without speaking. What is it? The Duke said from across the table. Another letter, she said. From the Camino. She looked up. From his brother. The Duke set down his pen. She looked back at the letter. The handwriting was different from the commander's larger, less disciplined, the letters of a man who wrote less frequently and felt more when he did. The Latin was simpler, rougher, and at the top of the page, in larger letters underlined twice ad filios filiasque. For my sons and daughters. Her voice when she spoke was very even. He wrote back, she said, the brother. He received the commander's letter, and he wrote back. And then I think he kept both. He kept his brother's letter and his own response. Together, for the rest of his life. She touched the edge of the page. And then he gave them to his children. The Duke was quiet for a moment. What does it say? She translated it slowly, pausing where the Latin was rough, filling in the gaps the way her father had taught her, not by guessing, but by listening to the shape of the sentences, the weight of what the words were carrying. The letter said, I received your words the night before your battle. I was not there. I have never stopped being ashamed of that. But I did what you asked. I came home, I built what you could not build. I named my firstborn son for you, and I have told him every year of his life who you were, so that you would not be forgotten. You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. Not while I live. Not while my children live. Not while their children live. She set the page down. The room was very quiet. Miss Hartwell, the Duke said. And his voice had changed, lost some of its precision, some of its careful flatness. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. She was not entirely fine, but that was not his business. She picked up her pen. The name, she said, the firstborn son. He gives the name in the final line. She found it. She read it, and then she stopped. She read it again. She set the pen down. What is it? He said. She looked up at him across the table. And for the first time that morning, she was not entirely sure how to control her expression. The name of the firstborn son, she said carefully. The one the brother named for the commander. She paused. It's Whitmore. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever sat inside. The Duke did not move. Say that again. The Latin form is Whitmora. It's a Latinized version of a regional name not Roman in origin. The brother was naming his son in the Roman style. For the record, but the name itself is. She stopped. It's your name, your grace, or the origin of it. This man, this Roman soldier who received his brother's letter and built a family in his brother's memory, he is. If this document is genuine, the documented ancestor of the Whitmore line. She watched his face. She watched him absorb it. She watched him do what she had seen him do once before, take something large and unexpected and run it through whatever internal machinery he used to process the world. Coming out the other side not shaken but recalibrated. That's why the property claim matters, he said. It wasn't a question. The disputed land, she said slowly. Has it been in your family for how long? 40 years officially. But my family has occupied it for what the records suggest is considerably longer. He paused. The opposing claimant argues there is no documentation of original ownership. That our claim is based on custom and occupation, not verified lineage. And if I can prove the lineage goes back 2,000 years, then the claim is not just verified. He met her eyes. It's unassailable. She should have felt triumphant. She had found in 4 hours what a room full of scholars had failed to find in 3 weeks. She had found something that could change everything for him, for his family, for his estate, for 40 years of disputed history. Instead, walking back through the city that afternoon, she felt the first cold finger of doubt, because Fairfax had been there when the Duke announced her reassignment. Fairfax had heard everything, and Fairfax, she already knew, was not a man who accepted being displaced without a response. She got back to her rooming house at 4 o'clock. Mrs. Aldrich was waiting in the hallway with a letter. Delivered this morning, she said, her expression carrying the specific satisfaction of someone delivering bad news. From the society. Evelyn opened it. It was from the administrative board. Formal language, 3 paragraphs. The substance was simple. Pending review of her credentials and the circumstances of her reassignment. Her access to society facilities was suspended, effective immediately. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. "Bad news," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Nothing I didn't expect," Evelyn said. And when upstairs, she sat at her desk. She opened her father's notebook. She did not read it. She just held it, feeling the weight of it, the familiar worn softness of the cover. Fairfax had moved fast, faster than she had given him credit for. A suspension pending review meant nothing permanent. Not yet, but it meant that her access to the Society's own collection was cut off. And more importantly, it meant there was now an official question mark next to her name. In a world where her name had no official weight to begin with, a question mark was nearly as good as a deletion. She thought about the documents on the Duke's table. 14 pieces of vellum, 3 fragments, 1 partial scroll. She had translated 4 of them. She needed the rest. She thought about the firstborn son named Whitmore, and his father's letter, and the Roman commander who had known he was going to die and had written to his brother anyway, asking him not to grieve but to live, she thought. "I am not going to let Fairfax take this from me." She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter to Alexander Whitmore, factual, brief, without complaint. She explained the suspension, explained what it meant for access to any supplementary society documents, and asked whether it was possible to continue working from the documents already in his possession at Whitmore House. She sent it with a boy from the street and waited. The reply came back in 2 hours. It said, "Come tomorrow. 7 o'clock. Bring whatever you need," she read it. She put it down. She picked up her father's notebook. She read his unfinished translations until the lamp burned low. She was at Whitmore House at 6:55. This time, he was already in the workroom when she arrived. He was standing at the table, looking at the documents, and he turned when she came in with an expression that told her he had already been thinking about this for some time. "Fairfax," he said. "Yes," she said. He went to the board. "Yes? How long have you known he was going to?" She sat down and opened her notebook. "Since the moment you said my name in that room, and his face did what it did." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "What did his face do?" "The same thing every man's face does," she said. "When he realizes that the person he dismissed was better at his job than he is." Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "What do you need to continue?" "Access to your document." "Which I already have." "A reference copy of the 3rd century Provincial Administrative Index." "Which I had at the Society but don't have here." She paused. "And possibly your word that if Fairfax gets the suspension made permanent, you'll say something to someone." "I'll say something now." "Not yet," she said. He looked at her. "Why not?" "Because if you intervene now, it looks like I need you to. And then every translation I produce becomes something your protection made possible, instead of something my work made possible." She held his gaze. "Wait until I've finished. Wait until the work is done and the case is made. Then say whatever you want." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned, in 2 days of working alongside him, that his silences were not empty, they were active. Processing, moving through considerations at a pace she was still calibrating. "All right," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I'll have the provincial index sent from my personal collection. I have a copy somewhere in the East Library." He stood. "Tea first. You look like you haven't slept." "I slept," she said. "How much?" She didn't answer. He looked at her for one more moment, then left to find the tea. She turned to the documents and went back to work. By the end of the 2nd day at Whitmore House, she had translated 8 of the 14 documents. By the end of the 3rd day, she had translated 11. And she and the Duke had stopped speaking only in questions and answers. They had started not arguing exactly, but testing. She would offer a reading. He would push back on the historical context. She would explain her reasoning. He would find a flaw, or he wouldn't. And they would move forward together. It was the kind of conversation she had not had since her father and she was careful not to let herself feel too much about that. On the fourth day, she found the problem. It was in the 12th document, a property record. The most legible of the 14, the one that should have been the simplest. She was working through it steadily when she hit a phrase in the third section that stopped her cold. She read it again and again. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant and did not like any of the conclusions she arrived at. "You've stopped," the Duke said from across the table. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She looked at him. "The property record. Section 3, the original grant of land." She paused. "It doesn't say what you think it says." He set down his pen. "Explain." "The Latin phrase here," she pointed to the line, "has been read, I assume, as a grant of land in perpetuity to the Whitmore line. Specifically to the male Whitmore line. Standard entailment language." "Yes, it's not entailment language," she said. "The word they've been reading as heredibus, heirs plural, is singular. One specific heir. And the qualifier," she pointed again. "This phrase here, which would normally modify the heir's gender, doesn't. It's grammatically neutral. Which means the original grant was not to the male line." She looked up at him. "It was to one named heir, without gender specification. Which means the current entailment that the opposing claimant is using to challenge your position, the argument that the line of inheritance was broken when your grandmother held the estate, that argument is based on a mistranslation." He was very still. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain about the Latin. The legal implications are above my expertise." He stood up. He walked around the table and stood beside her, looking at the document. She did not move over. He leaned in close enough that she could hear him breathing, looking at the line she was pointing to. "Show me," he said quietly. She showed him. She walked him through it word by word, explaining each grammatical choice the way her father had walked her through texts at the kitchen table. He followed closely, asking sharp questions, not performing understanding but actually building it. She found, to her slight surprise, that he was genuinely capable of following the argument, not because he knew Latin, but because he was intelligent enough to track the logic even when the language was foreign. When she finished, he straightened up. He stood very close to her for a moment, not speaking. She was aware of the proximity in a way she was not generally in the habit of being aware of things that didn't directly affect her work. She looked at the document. He looked at the document. 40 years, he said. "Yes, 40 years of legal argument based on a misread word." "2 misread words," she said. "To be precise." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course." He moved back to his side of the table. She exhaled very quietly. "Miss Hartwell," he said, sitting down. "Yes, I owe you an apology." She looked up. He was looking at her directly, without the careful calibration he usually wore. "What I said in the hall. The first morning." A pause. It was what it was," she said. "You don't need to," he said. It came out more plainly than she thought he intended. He paused. "I said something dismissive and I was wrong. And I would prefer to acknowledge that directly rather than simply behaving better and hoping you notice." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the men who had dismissed her and never once acknowledged it. She thought about Fairfax, who was at this moment almost certainly writing letters designed to end her career before it had properly started. "Accepted," she said. "Thank you." He picked up his pen. "Now, tell me what else is in these documents that no one has managed to find." She turned back to her notes. She found herself somewhere very quietly, and against her better judgment, almost the 5th day. Fairfax came to Whitmore House. She was alone in the workroom. The Duke had gone to meet his solicitor. Something about the legal implications of what she had found, and had told her to continue without him when she heard the voice in the entrance hall. Loud, important, designed to carry. She set down her pen. She listened. "I must insist," Fairfax was saying, "that His Grace be made aware of the very serious questions surrounding Miss Hartwell's credentials. The Society's review board has significant concerns regarding the basis on which she was granted access to historical documents of this sensitivity. The butler's voice. Measured and neutral, His Grace is not available. Sir, then I will wait. That may be some time. Sir, I will wait, Fairfax said again, sharper this time. For as long as is necessary. She sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked out to the entrance hall. Fairfax was standing near the door, hat in hand, red in the face from the cold, or from anger, or from both. He saw her, and his expression went through three things very quickly: surprise, irritation, and then the specific hostility of a man who has prepared a speech and found his intended audience replaced by someone inconvenient. Miss Hartwell, he said. Dr. Fairfax, she said. His Grace isn't here, but I am. If you have concerns about my work, you can address them to me directly. He blinked. He had not expected that. The proper channel is you know what's in these documents, she said. Or rather, you know what you thought was in them. I've found something different. She watched his face. You're not here because you're concerned about my credentials. You're here because you're concerned about what I'm finding. His jaw tightened. That is a remarkable accusation. It's an observation, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her with the particular fury of a man who has held a position of unchallenged authority for so long that challenge itself has become offensive. You are a copying assistant, he said, with no verified academic background, no institutional affiliation, and no standing in this field. Whatever you believe you have found in those documents will not be accepted by the scholarly community without verification by someone with appropriate credentials, she said. Yes, like yours. Yes, she let the word sit there for a moment. Let him hear it. Your last 3 published translations, she said, contain 11 errors. I know because I corrected them. From the copying room, without being asked and without being credited, she held his gaze. I have the originals. I have the dates. She paused. Now, do you want to keep talking about credentials? Or would you like to discuss what I've actually found? The entrance hall was very quiet. Fairfax's face had gone a color that was not entirely healthy. The butler, to his credit, appeared to be studying a point on the wall with absolute concentration. You will regret this, Fairfax said. His voice was low now. The loud, important quality was gone. What was left was something quieter and more specific. I have spent 30 years building relationships in this field. I know every editor, every board member, every institution that matters. You are nobody, you have nothing. And when I am finished, no one in this country will touch your name. She looked at him. She thought about her father's hands going cold. She thought about the Roman commander writing his letter in the dark before the last battle. She thought about 11 corrections, unacknowledged, absorbed into someone else's authority without a trace. Then you'd better get started, she said, because I have work to finish. She turned and walked back to the workroom. She sat down at the table. She picked up her pen. Her hand was perfectly steady. She heard the front door close. She looked at the documents in front of her. 12 translations completed, 2 remaining. The Truth of the Whitmore Estate's Origin. Sitting in Latin 2,000 years old on a table in London. Waiting for someone with the right kind of patience to read it correctly. She thought, he can go to every editor and board member in England. He can say whatever he wants. She thought, the documents will still say what they say. She dipped her pen. She went back to work. The Duke returned at 4 o'clock. He came into the workroom without knocking. He had stopped knocking after the second day and stopped when he saw her face. What happened? He said. Fairfax was here. Went 2 hours ago. He left. He set his coat down. He looked at her with that careful, calibrated attention he was apparently incapable of turning off. What did he say? That he would make sure no institution in England would work with me. She said it flatly, without inflection. He was fairly specific about it. The Duke's expression went very still. Miss Hartwell, I told you I didn't want you to intervene yet. That was before he came to my house. It doesn't change my reasoning. It changes mine, he said. His voice was quiet, but it had an edge in it she hadn't heard before, something that had nothing to do with professional calculation. He came to my home while I was absent to threaten the person working on my commission. That is not a scholarly dispute. That is something else entirely. She looked at him. She looked at the documents in front of her. She looked at the 2 remaining pages, the last pieces of a 2,000-year-old story about brothers and loyalty and what you build in someone else's name. Let me finish first, she said. Why? Because when you go to war with Fairfax, I want the work to already be complete. I want it documented, verified, and ready. She looked up at him. I don't want to be the woman you fought for. I want to be the woman whose work you supported. There is a difference. And it matters, and I need you to understand that. He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She had learned that his silences needed to be waded through rather than filled. How long? He said finally. Tonight, she said. I'll finish tonight. He looked at her. He looked at the documents. He pulled out his chair and sat down. Then I'll stay, he said. I'll handle the lamp. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Your Grace, she said carefully. You don't have to, he said. He opened his own correspondence. He began reading. He did not look at her again. She turned back to the manuscript. Outside, London went dark. Inside the workroom, 2 lamps burned. And the scratch of her pen was the only sound, and somewhere in the final document, in the last piece of a story that had been waiting 2,000 years to be finished, the Roman brothers line ended with a phrase she translated slowly. Carefully, set down her pen. Done, she said. He looked up. She slid the final translation across the table to him. He read it. She watched his face while he read, and she saw the moment it landed, the full weight of what she had found settled into him. He set the page down. He looked at her across the lamplight, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. It's everything, he said. Yes. The lineage, the property. The original grant, all of it. All of it. He picked up the page again. He read it once more as if making sure it was real. Miss Hartwell, he sat up, and she saw, for the first time since she had walked into that hall on December the 15th, something in his face that was not calculation, not assessment, not the careful management of a man who had learned to keep himself at a controlled distance from everything that mattered. He just looked at her. Thank you, he said simply. Directly, the way he did everything when he stopped performing and started meaning it. She held his gaze for exactly as long as she trusted herself to. Then she closed her notebook, capped her pen, and stood up. Send word when you're ready for the presentation, she said. I'll be there. I know, he said. She walked out of Whitmore House into the cold London night. She walked home through streets she was only beginning to know. Past lamplights she was only beginning to stop being surprised by. In a city that did not yet know her name, she thought about Fairfax and his 30 years, and his editors and boards and every institution that mattered. She thought about her father's notebook and the unfinished translations, and the men whose names had been erased from history while other men took credit for their existence. She thought, not this time. The cold was sharp. She turned up her collar. She walked faster. She had a presentation to prepare for. The letter from the Royal Historical Society's Administrative Board arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after she finished the final translation. It was not the suspension notice. That had already come and gone. This was something different, a formal summons, printed on heavy cream paper with the Society's seal pressed into the top. She read it standing in the hallway of the rooming house, still in her coat, her fingers cold from the walk. The Society requested her presence at a full presentation before the Royal Scholars Review Committee. 7 days hence, the Dunmore findings were to be formally assessed. All parties with interest in the documentation were invited to present their positions. All parties, she knew what that meant. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She went upstairs, and she sat at her desk, and she looked at the 3 books on the windowsill for a long time without doing anything else. Then she picked up her pen and she began to prepare. She worked for 6 days straight. Not on new translations, those were done. She worked on the argument, the structure of the case. Every grammatical decision she had made, annotated and sourced. Every historical parallel she had drawn, verified, and cross-referenced. Every place where a reasonable scholar might push back. Anticipated and answered. She built it the way her father had taught her to build anything worth defending from the inside out. Starting with the thing you were most afraid someone would attack. Making that the foundation instead of the weakness. On the 3rd night, Alexander came to the rooming house. She heard the knock at 7 in the evening and found him at the door. Which surprised her. He had not struck her as a man who made unannounced visits. He was carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of someone who had information he was not sure how to deliver. "May I come in?" he said. He came in. Looked briefly at the narrow room, the desk covered in papers. The 3 books on the windowsill, the lamp burning close to empty, and said nothing about any of it. "Fairfax submitted a formal challenge," he said. "I know. He's brought 2 additional scholars. Men from Cambridge. Their names carry weight with the committee. I know that too." He looked at her. "How? Because it's what I would do," she said, "if I were him. If I had 30 years of reputation at stake and someone had just found 11 errors in my published work and was about to say so in front of the full review committee." She sat down at her desk. "He's not wrong to be scared. He should be scared." Alexander set the satchel on the table. "I've had my solicitor review the property documentation. The legal case is strong, very strong, but it depends entirely on the scholarly consensus around your translations." He paused. "If the committee rejects your reading, they won't." Evelyn. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it. She did not comment on it. Fairfax has allies on that committee. 3 members who have published alongside him, who have professional reasons to support his interpretation. Even if your translation is correct, and I believe it is, the vote may not reflect that. She turned in her chair and looked at him directly. "Then I'll have to make it impossible for them to vote against it." He looked at her for a moment. "How?" "By being so exact, so specific, and so thoroughly documented that rejecting my findings requires them to publicly commit to a position they cannot academically defend." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to walk in there and ask them to believe me. I'm going to walk in there and show them the evidence until the only way to argue with me is to lie." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right. I came here because I thought you might need—" He stopped. Reconsidered. "I came here because I wanted to know if you were ready." "I've been ready," she said. "Since December the 15th. Something shifted in his face. She had become, over the past weeks, better at reading the small movements of it, the slight tightening that meant he was recalibrating. The particular stillness that meant something had landed in a way he hadn't expected. He picked up the satchel. "My solicitor will be present at the presentation. If the committee makes a decision that has legal implications, I want counsel in the room." "Fine, and I will be there, I know," she said. "I won't speak unless you ask me to." "I know that too," she said. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. And she had the sense he was about to say something he had not planned to say. She waited. "Your father," he said. "You've never told me about him." She looked at the notebook on the corner of her desk. "He was a Latin teacher," she said, "in Virginia. He never published anything. He never had a position at a university. He spent 40 years teaching other people's children and reading on his own time." She paused. "He was the best scholar I have ever known." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. "He would have found this extraordinary," he said quietly. Not a question. He would have. He nodded once. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet he left behind. Then she turned back to her papers and kept working. The morning of the presentation. She woke at 5. She dressed carefully, her better dress, the dark green wool, the one she had been saving since London because she had known, without being able to say exactly when, that there would be a morning when it mattered. She pinned her hair. She looked in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like what she was, a woman who had not slept enough and had worked too hard and was about to walk into the most important room of her life. Good enough, she thought. She picked up her papers. She picked up her father's notebook. She did not know exactly why. Only that it felt wrong to go without it. She walked out into the cold morning and she made her way across the city to the Royal Historical Society. The building looked exactly as it always had, the same dark stone, the same polished door. She had walked through it dozens of times as a copying assistant. Invisible, her arms full of other people's work, she pushed the door open and walked in. The great presentation hall was already half full when she arrived, which surprised her. She had expected a committee proceeding formal. Small, technical. What she found was larger. The 7 members of the review committee sat at the elevated table at the front of the room. Below them, in the gallery seating, were perhaps 40 people scholars, she assumed, and society members and several faces she didn't recognize who had the look of legal counsel. Fairfax was already there. He was seated at the presenter's table to the left, flanked by 2 men she didn't know, but who had the particular posture of Cambridge academics, a kind of settled certainty. The physical expression of men who had never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong in public. She walked to the presenter's table on the right. She set down her papers. She sat down. Fairfax looked at her across the gap between the tables. He said nothing. His expression said everything it needed to. The 2 Cambridge men looked at her, the way men like them always looked at women like her, a brief, dismissive scan, followed by the return of their attention to something they considered more relevant. She looked straight ahead. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the Roman commander, writing in the dark. She thought about the firstborn son named Whitmore, and his father's letter, and the phrase at the end of the final document that she had translated by lamplight while Alexander sat across the table and didn't say a word. She thought, I have been preparing for this my entire life. The committee chairman called the session to order. Fairfax presented first. He was good at it, she had to give him that. 40 minutes, organized, authoritative, his voice filling the room with the comfortable confidence of a man in his natural habitat. He presented his own reading of the Dunmore documents. He challenged the provenance. He questioned the chain of custody from the estate to the society. He introduced his 2 Cambridge colleagues, who each spoke for 10 minutes in support of his interpretation. Their core argument was simple, and she had anticipated every word of it. The documents were genuine, but the readings were ambiguous. The Latin was irregular. The interpretation of the property record as anything other than standard male line entailment was a stretch. The word she had identified as singular could be read as plural in the relevant dialect. And the identification of the name Whitmore in a 3rd century Roman document was, at best, speculative. They were careful. They were polished. They did not mention her name once. They spoke about the documents as if her translations did not exist. When Fairfax sat down, one of the Cambridge men poured him water, and they exchanged the small, satisfied look of men who believed they had just closed a door. The committee chairman turned to her table. Miss Hartwell, he said, with the careful neutrality of a man trying very hard not to signal anything. You may present. She stood up. She looked at the committee. 7 men, ranging in age from 50 to perhaps 70. 3 of them had published alongside Fairfax. She knew their names from the documents she had corrected in the copying room. 2 were independent. One was the Lord Chancellor's representative, which she had not expected, and which changed the calculation slightly. She looked at the gallery. She found Alexander in the 3rd row, sitting very still, watching her. He gave her nothing, no encouragement, nothing that could be read as support or influence. Just his attention, steady and complete. She turned back to the committee. "Gentlemen," she said, "Dr. Fairfax has presented you with an interpretation. I'm going to present you with evidence. The difference matters. So I want to name it clearly at the outset." She picked up the first page of her prepared argument. "Every claim I make this morning will be sourced to a specific line, a specific word, and a specific grammatical construction. If you wish to challenge any of my readings, I ask that you do so with the same specificity. Not with general assertions about dialect ambiguity or interpretive range with the specific word. The specific construction and the specific alternative reading you believe is more accurate." She paused. "I make this request," she said, "because I have found that vague challenges to precise scholarship are most frequently made by people who cannot produce a precise counter-argument." The room was very quiet. Fairfax's face had gone the unhealthy color she was beginning to recognize. She began. She worked through the documents in order. And she was precise in the way that only someone who has spent their entire life being told they probably couldn't do something learns to be precise. Every word sourced, every grammatical choice explained. She cited parallels from other 3rd century provincial texts she had memorized, because she had not been able to bring them from the Society's collection after her suspension, and so she had committed them to memory instead. She presented the 3 separate hands in the commander's letter and walked the committee through how she had distinguished them. She explained the emotional and linguistic register of the text not as subjective interpretation, but as a grammatical fact demonstrating how the verb tenses and pronoun choices shifted between the formal administrative sections and the personal ones. When she reached the property record, she slowed down. "The word in question," she said, "is in the 3rd line of the 2nd section. Dr. Fairfax has argued that it should be read as the plural heritibus, meaning heirs in the conventional entailment sense. I will demonstrate that this reading is grammatically impossible." She looked directly at the committee chairman. "Not unlikely, not open to interpretation, impossible." She explained why. She took 12 minutes on that single word. She brought in 4 parallel usages from other documents of the same period to demonstrate the consistent grammatical pattern. She showed where the letter form in the Dunmore document differed from the plural form at a micro level, a difference so small it required a magnifying lens to see, but visible, documented, and reproducible. When she finished that section, one of the independent committee members, a man named Dawson, who had said nothing throughout Fairfax's presentation, leaned forward. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "the parallel text you cited, the Provincial Administrative Index, how did you access those while your society privileges were suspended?" She met his eyes. "I memorized them before the suspension took effect." Dawson looked at her for a moment. "All of them?" "The relevant sections," she said. Yes, he sat back. He said nothing else. But she saw something change in his expression, a small recalibration. The same kind she had seen in Alexander's face on the first morning. And she knew she had him. She kept going. The first twist came at the 40-minute mark. And she had been waiting for it. One of the Cambridge men, the younger one, who had been taking notes throughout with the focused intensity of someone building a counter-argument, raised his hand. The chairman nodded. "Dr. Reeves, Miss Hartwell." Reeves had a pleasant voice and a very unpleasant precision about him. The identification of the name Whitmore in the 3rd century document. You've argued that the Latinized form Whitmora represents an early form of the name. I'd like to challenge that specifically. Go ahead, she said. The name Whitmore, as we know it in the English context, appears in records no earlier than the 11th century. The gap between 3rd century and 11th century is 800 years. You're asking this committee to accept an unbroken linguistic chain across that gap with no intermediate documentation. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for it specifically because it was the strongest point in their case, and she had known they would use it. You're right, she said. I am asking you to accept that chain. Reeves blinked. He had expected her to argue. Then you acknowledge. I'm asking you to accept it, she said. Because I have the intermediate documentation. The room went still. She reached into her folder and produced 4-page copies she had made herself. By hand, from documents she had found in the Whitmore House Library during the 6th night of working there. When she had gotten up at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, and started going through shelves that hadn't been properly catalogued in 30 years. Property records from the 7th century, she said. Norman administrative documents from the 9th, a church registry from the 10th century. She walked the pages to the committee table herself, because she wanted to watch their faces when they saw them. The name evolves. It changes form across 800 years. The way all names do. But the lineage is traceable. She stood at the committee table and looked at Reeves directly. I found these in His Grace's own library. They had not been previously identified as relevant, because no one had been looking for the right name in the right century. She walked back to her table. She sat down. I will note, she said, that these documents were found as a direct result of following the thread established by the Dunmore manuscript. Without the correct translation of the manuscript, the library records remain unconnected. With the correct translation, they form a continuous chain. She paused, which is precisely why the correct translation matters. Reeves looked at the pages. He looked at his Cambridge colleague. He looked at Fairfax. Fairfax was looking at the pages with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She looked at it for a moment, trying to name it, and then she recognized it. She had seen it once on a graduate student. Her father had described a young man who had spent 3 years on a thesis only to discover that a woman in another state had already published the core argument. The thesis would still be completed. The degree would still be awarded. But the original contribution was gone. The thing that was supposed to matter was already someone else's. Fairfax was looking at 30 years, and he was starting to understand what she had found. She kept going for another 40 minutes. The second Cambridge man stopped taking notes around the 30-minute mark. She noticed that. The committee's independent member, Dawson, had moved forward in his chair and stayed there. The Lord Chancellor's representative had stopped looking at his watch. The 3 committee members who had published alongside Fairfax were conferring quietly among themselves in a way that had shifted from supportive to something more complicated. She noticed all of it. She kept going. When she reached the final document, the brother's letter, the one that had stopped her cold on the second morning, the one she had saved for last because it was the most important and the most human, and the hardest to read aloud without betraying something, she stopped for a moment. She looked at her father's notebook, which was on the table in front of her. She had not opened it during the presentation. She did not need to. But she looked at it now. Then she looked at the committee. The final document, she said, is not primarily relevant to the property claim. The property is established by the record I have already presented. She paused. But I want to read it to you anyway, because it is the reason any of this matters. She translated the brother's letter aloud. From memory, the way she had translated it the first time, not reciting, but understanding, letting the meaning come before the sound. She translated it the way her father had taught her, like a human being. When she finished, the hall was completely silent. Not the silence of disagreement, not the silence of professional assessment. The silence of people who had been reminded, suddenly and without warning, that the documents they had been arguing about for the past 2 hours were written by actual people who had loved each other and lost each other and tried, in the only way they had available, to make sure that love was not forgotten. The chairman cleared his throat. He looked at his hands. He looked at the committee. Then he looked at Fairfax. "Dr. Fairfax," he said carefully, "in light of the documentation presented, including the intermediate library records, which I think we must acknowledge are significant, do you wish to revise your position?" Fairfax did not answer immediately. She watched him. She watched him do the calculation. She could see it happening. The assessment of what was salvageable, what had to be conceded. What he could argue had been a matter of interpretation rather than error. She watched him arrive, slowly and visibly, at the conclusion she had known he would eventually reach. The intermediate documentation, he said, requires further independent verification before. It's in your own collection, she said. He looked at her. The Whitmore Library records, she said. I found them in His Grace's collection, which is accessible, which can be verified by any member of this committee within the hour if they choose to walk there. She paused. Would you like me to write down which shelf? The silence that followed was the most satisfying silence she had ever sat inside. Dawson made a sound that he turned very quickly into a cough. Fairfax said nothing. The committee chairman looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at the Lord Chancellor's representative. Something passed between them, a very small, very significant communication. I think the chairman said that this committee will require a brief recess before deliberating. The recess lasted 25 minutes. She sat at her table and did not move. She did not drink the water that had been placed in front of her. She did not look at Fairfax, who was speaking in low, urgent tones with the Cambridge men across the gap. She looked at her papers. She breathed. Alexander appeared at her side without warning. Coming from the gallery. You need to drink something, he said quietly. I'm fine, you've been talking for 2 hours. He put a glass of water in front of her. Drink it. He stood beside her table. Not sitting, not performing ease. Standing. Present. The Lord Chancellor's man, she said quietly. He looked up when I presented the property record. Specifically at the entailment section. Yes, Alexander said. Is there something I'm missing about the legal implications? He was quiet for a moment. The opposing claimant filed a new brief last week. I didn't want it to affect your preparation. He paused. They argued that even if my lineage is proven, the female line inheritance through my grandmother was irregular under common law. Regardless of the original Latin grant, she looked at him. That's why the grammatically neutral gender in the original grant matters even more than I said. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want it to change how you presented the scholarship. He met her eyes. You said you wanted the work to stand on its own. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about a man who had dismissed her in 4 words and then spent 6 weeks getting out of her way so she could work. Who had sat across a table from her in lamplight without saying anything unnecessary. Who had come to her rooming house not to manage her, but to ask if she was ready. She thought he actually listened to what I said, she said. When the committee comes back, if they ask about the gender neutrality of the original grant, let me answer it. Don't have your solicitor answer it. I know, he said. I need to hear you say it. You'll answer it, he said. I won't speak unless you ask me to, she nodded. She turned back to her papers. He went back to the gallery. The committee returned. The chairman sat. He arranged his papers. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with and had decided to make it anyway. This committee has reviewed the documentation presented by Miss Hartwell, he said, alongside the challenge presented by Dr. Fairfax and his colleagues. We have several questions before we proceed to deliberation. The questions came fast, and she answered each one without hesitation, because she had anticipated every single one of them. The property record, she walked them through the grammar again. More slowly this time, watching their faces until she could see each one of them actually follow it. The intermediate documents, she described each one. Its location in the Whitmore Library, the precise shelf, the cataloging notation. The commander's letter, she explained the linguistic register again. The specific markers of Western Provincial Military Latin. The emotional weight of the verb tenses. Then the chairman said, Miss Hartwell, the gender-neutral construction in the original grant. Dr. Fairfax argues that even accepting your reading, English common law would supersede the intent of a Roman document in a property dispute under current jurisdiction. She had known this was coming. She had known since Alexander told her about the new brief. With respect, she said, The question before this committee is not how English common law applies to the Roman document. The question is what the Roman document says. She paused. What it says is that the original grant was made to a named heir without gender specification. That is a historical fact, not a legal opinion. What the courts do with that historical fact is the Lord Chancellor's concern, not mine. She looked at the Lord Chancellor's representative directly. But I would suggest that a historical fact, clearly established, is a stronger foundation for any legal argument than ambiguity that turns out not to exist. The representative looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something on his notepad. He did not show it to anyone. The chairman looked at Fairfax. Dr. Fairfax, do you have a response to the grammatical evidence regarding the property record? Fairfax looked at his hands. He looked at the two Cambridge men. He looked at his own published translations, which were sitting on the committee table, which contained 11 errors that were now part of the official record of this proceeding. The grammatical distinction Miss Hartwell has identified, he said slowly, is present. I will acknowledge that it is present. He stopped. He started again. The interpretation she has drawn from it is not without merit. The room was very quiet. She did not react. She did not allow herself to react. She sat perfectly still and let the words exist in the air. Not without merit. From Fairfax, in front of the full review committee. After 30 years, she thought about her father's kitchen table. She thought about Virginia and winter light and the smell of old books and a man who had never been given a position at a university and had spent 40 years being right anyway. She thought he would have laughed. He would have put his head back and laughed. She kept her face still. The chairman deliberated with the committee for 11 minutes. Right there at the table, in low voices she couldn't fully hear. She watched. She breathed. She held her father's notebook and did not open it. At the end of 11 minutes, the chairman looked up. This committee accepts Miss Hartwell's translation of the Dunmore manuscript as the official scholarly reading, he said. The documentation will be entered into the Society's record under her name. He paused. Furthermore, the intermediate documents she has identified in the Whitmore collection will be catalogued and added to the relevant historical record. Another pause. Longer. This committee also notes for the record that 11 translation errors previously published under Dr. Fairfax's name have been identified and will require formal correction in the Society's archives. Fairfax did not move. The chairman looked at her. Miss Hartwell, do you have anything to add? She stood up. She thought about what to say. She had prepared words for this moment. She had written them out the night before. Refined them, made them precise and measured. She looked at the committee. She looked at the gallery, at Alexander sitting very still in the third row. She put the prepared words away. Only this, she said. The Roman commander, whose letter we have been discussing today, died in a battle that has no name in any history book. His soldiers died with him. They were forgotten. The only reason we know any of them existed is because a brother kept a letter and told his children the story. And his children told their children, and the story survived even when the names didn't. She paused. I would like this committee to consider as it goes forward. What else we have lost because we decided in advance was capable of finding it. She sat down. The room was silent for a long time. Then Dawson began to clap. He was the only one for a moment. Then the Lord Chancellor's representative. Then the second independent committee member. The gallery started slowly at first, then faster until the sound filled the room and Fairfax sat in the middle of it, like a man caught in weather he had not predicted. She did not stand up again. She did not bow. She sat at the table with her hands folded over her father's notebook, and she let the sound wash over her, and she thought about nothing in particular for a full 30 seconds, which was the closest thing to peace she had felt since Virginia. Then she picked up her papers. She had work to do. The applause stopped, the room emptied, and then the real trouble began. She knew it was coming. She had known it the moment Dawson started clapping. because she had watched Fairfax's face during those 30 seconds of sound, and she had seen something harden in him, not break. Not collapse, but compress, become smaller and denser and more dangerous. A man who has lost publicly does not stop, he reorganizes. She found out how he had reorganized 4 days later, when the first newspaper ran the story. She was at Whitmore House, working through the cataloging of the intermediate library documents the Duke had asked her to prepare a formal index for the Lord Chancellor's office when Mrs. Aldrich sent a boy with a note that simply said, "You should see today's paper." She sent the boy back. She kept working. She finished the section she was on, noted the final entry, set down her pen, and then walked to the door and asked the Whitmore butler to bring her a copy of the morning edition. The headline was not about her work, it was about her. American woman at center of Whitmore manuscript controversy, questions raised over qualifications and propriety of Duke's arrangement. She read the article standing in the hallway. It was careful in the specific way of pieces written by people who know exactly what they are doing and want to be able to deny it later. It did not call her incompetent. It raised questions. It noted with apparent concern that an unmarried American woman of no institutional affiliation had been granted unusual private access to a Duke's personal library. It quoted anonymous scholarly sources expressing discomfort with the arrangement. It mentioned in the final paragraph that Dr. Fairfax and his colleagues had requested an independent verification of the Dunmore findings by a panel of European scholars. She folded the paper, she handed it back to the butler. She walked back to the workroom and she sat down and she looked at the cataloging index for a long moment without seeing it. Then she picked up her pen and she kept working. Alexander came in an hour later. He was carrying his own copy of the paper, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who had been containing anger for some time and was not entirely succeeding. "I've seen it," she said without looking up. "I'm going to call my solicitor." "About the paper?" "About Fairfax." He sat down. He put the paper face down on the table as if he didn't want to look at it. "This is him. The anonymous sources, the questions about propriety, this is a coordinated response to the committee's decision." "Yes," she said. "He lost the scholarly argument, so he's moved to a different arena." "Yes," she said again. "Evelyn." He waited until she looked up. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. The propriety angle, the suggestion that there's something irregular about you working here, that kind of story travels. It attaches to a woman's name in a way it doesn't attach to a man's, I know," she said. "I want to make a public statement. My solicitor can draft—" "No," she said. He stopped. "Not yet." She held his gaze. "If you make a statement now, the story becomes about you defending me. And then every question becomes about whether your defense is credible, which becomes about whether our arrangement is credible. Which is exactly where Fairfax wants this to go." She set down her pen. "The only thing that ends this is the work, the publication. My name on the findings, in print in a scholarly journal that cannot be dismissed." She paused. "How long to get it published?" He thought about it. "If I contact the editor of the Archaeological Review directly, 2 months. Maybe 6 weeks if there's a gap in the next issue." "Then get me 6 weeks," she said. "Keep the solicitor ready." "But not yet." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense again of being genuinely seen, not managed. Not assessed for liability, but actually seen. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to work. The second piece ran a week later. This one was less careful. It appeared in a smaller publication, the kind that operated in the margins of respectability, and was read by people who wanted their suspicions confirmed rather than their knowledge expanded. It named her directly. It described her as a self-styled scholar of uncertain background who had ingratiated herself with a duke of established reputation. It questioned why a woman with no university degree and no institutional standing had been permitted to handle documents of national historical significance. It used the word inappropriate 4 times in 3 paragraphs. She read it at her desk in the rooming house. She read it twice. Then she put it in the drawer where she kept the first one, and she opened her father's notebook, and she read the last entry he had written. The one about the men who were forgotten living in the space between words. And she sat with that for a while. Then she started writing the paper. Not the cataloging index. The paper itself, the full scholarly account of the Dunmore findings. Structured as a formal academic publication, with footnotes and cross-references and the complete grammatical argument laid out in the kind of detail that could not be dismissed or paraphrased into irrelevance. She had been building it in her head for weeks. She had been building it, she realized, since the night her father died, since the moment she read his last notebook entry and understood what he had been trying to tell her. She wrote for 8 days. She slept 4 hours a night and ate whatever misses. Aldrich left outside her door and she wrote. She wrote the way you do something you have been waiting your entire life to do, not frantically, not desperately, but with a steady, focused intensity that felt less like effort and more like finally being allowed to move at your actual speed. On the 4th day of writing, Alexander appeared at the rooming house again. He knocked at 7 in the evening, same as before. She opened the door. He looked at her, at the state of her. The dark circles and the ink on her fingers, and the particular wild-eyed focus of someone who has been deep inside their own work 4 days, and he said, "You need to eat a real meal. I can see that." He held up a paper bag. "I brought food from a place near the house. You can eat it while you work." She looked at him. She looked at the bag. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He sat in the only chair that wasn't covered in papers, which was the one by the window, and he opened the bag and put food on the corner of her desk without disturbing anything. She kept writing. He sat with his own paper's correspondence. She assumed the administrative weight of being a duke and worked alongside her in silence. At 10 o'clock she set down her pen. "Why are you here?" she said. He looked up from his papers. "I told you. Food. You have servants who could have sent food." "Yes." She waited. He set his papers down. He looked at her directly. The way he had started doing somewhere around the 2nd week, without the protective calibration, without the careful management of what he let show. "There was another article," he said. "This one in the Edinburgh Review. More prominent than the others." She felt her stomach drop. The Edinburgh Review was not a small publication. What did it say? The same things, phrased more formally. He paused. It also questioned the validity of the committee's decision. Called for an independent review. An independent review would reach the same conclusion. "I know that," he said. "They know that too. That's not the point." He looked at her steadily. "The point is to create enough noise that your name becomes associated with controversy rather than scholarship, so that when the paper is published, people encounter it already primed to doubt it." She thought about that. She thought about the Roman commander's letter, sitting in a filing case at the Society, officially recorded under her name now, which had felt like a victory 3 weeks ago and now felt like a target. "They're not going to stop," she said. "No," he said. "They're not. How bad is it going to get?" He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that about him. He did not soften things to make them easier. "Bad enough that you should be prepared for some of the people who applauded at the committee presentation to quietly distance themselves." He paused. "Academic careers are long. People protect them," she nodded slowly. She had known this. She had known it the way you know something intellectually before you know it in your body. And now she was starting to know it in her body. "The paper," she said. "Yes, the paper. If it's published before the independent review is formally requested, does that change the timeline?" "It changes the landscape," he said. "Once it's in print, in a peer-reviewed journal, the findings have a different kind of standing. They're harder to dismiss procedurally." He paused. "How close are you?" she said. "Maybe 3. He nodded. He picked his papers back up. "Then I'll let you work." He stayed until midnight. He didn't say anything else that mattered. He just stayed. Which turned out to be the thing she needed most and had not known how to ask for. When he left, She looked at the empty chair by the window for a moment. Then she turned back to her desk and kept writing. The paper was finished on a Thursday morning, 11 days after she started it. She read it through twice, correcting as she went. She read it a third time aloud, the way her father had taught her to proof her work, because the ear catches what the eye forgives. She found 2 weak transitions and 1 footnote that needed expansion. She fixed them. She read it one more time. Then she put it in an envelope, addressed it to Alexander, and sent it with a note that said, "Ready." His reply came back within the hour. "I'll contact the editor today." She put the note in the drawer with the newspaper articles. She looked at the drawer for a moment. Then she went to bed and slept for 12 hours. She woke to a different kind of problem. The letter was from the Society's administrative board, a different letter this time. Not a suspension, not a summons. A formal notification that Dr. Fairfax had submitted a complaint alleging that she had improperly accessed and removed Society documents during her time as copying assistant. Specifically, the copies of his translations that she had retained. The ones with her corrections written in the margins. The ones she had cited at the presentation. She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about the copies. She had made them herself, by hand on her own paper, on her own time, after hours. She had not taken originals. She had not removed anything from the building. She had copied documents she was employed to copy, added notations and kept her copies, she thought. Is that wrong? She turned the question over carefully. Because she had learned not to trust her immediate instinct when something felt unfair, the feeling of injustice was real, but it was not always legally precise. She thought, I was the copying assistant. I copied. The copies were mine. The notations were mine. The originals remained where they were. She thought, Fairfax is not wrong that I kept them. He is wrong about what that means. She sent a note to Alexander. She did not say she was alarmed. She said she needed his solicitor's assessment of a specific question, and could they meet that afternoon? He replied, 2 o'clock, Whitmore House. The solicitor's name was Pemberton. He was a small, precise man with the quality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where every word had consequences and had developed an appropriate relationship with silence as a result. He listened to her explain the situation without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3. Then he said, the copies are not the problem. No, she said. The corrections in the margins are not the problem either. They were made on your own paper, in your own time, for your own reference. He paused. The problem, if there is one, is that you cited them at the presentation as evidence of systematic error in Dr. Fairfax's work. But by citing them, you made them part of the official record, which means they are now subject to challenge. On what grounds? Alexander said. On the grounds that they represent one person's assessment of another person's work, documented privately and unilaterally, without the knowledge or consent of the person being assessed. Pemberton looked at her. It's a thin argument, but it gives Fairfax a procedural lever. She thought about it. If I had submitted the corrections formally at the time, if I had gone to the board with each one rather than keeping them, you would have been dismissed immediately, Alexander said. Yes, she said, I would have. So the choice, Pemberton said carefully, was between documenting the errors privately and being able to use them later, or reporting them formally and losing the ability to work entirely. He paused. That is not a choice a man in your position would have been required to make. The room was very quiet. She looked at Pemberton. She looked at Alexander. She thought about 11 corrections. 11 errors absorbed into Fairfax's published work without a trace. 11 times she had fixed something that was wrong and had not been permitted to say so out loud. What do we do? She said. Pemberton looked at Alexander. Something passed between them. There is a precedent, Pemberton said slowly, for private scholarly corrections being admitted as evidence of pattern in academic misconduct proceedings. If we shift the frame, if instead of defending the copies as evidence in a property case, we position them as documentation of a pattern of error by a senior scholar, then the complaint against me becomes a case against him, she said. It becomes considerably more complicated for him. Yes, she looked at Alexander. He was watching her with that steady, focused attention she had come to rely on more than she wanted to admit. It escalates, she said. Yes, he said. It goes from a property dispute and a scholarly disagreement to a formal misconduct proceeding. Yes, and my name is in the middle of all of it. Yes, he said. It is. Unless you want to settle quietly, accept a lesser credit on the publication. And no, she said. He had known she would say that. She could tell from the way he didn't react. Then we escalate, he said. The misconduct filing took Pemberton 2 weeks to prepare. In those 2 weeks, 3 things happened that she had not anticipated. The first was that Dawson, the independent committee member who had started clapping, contacted her directly. He asked if he could read the full paper before publication. She said yes. He read it in 2 days and wrote back with 4 pages of notes. All of them the kind of notes that make a paper stronger rather than smaller. She incorporated every one of them and sent him a reply that said simply, "Thank you. This is better because of you," he wrote back. It was already extraordinary. I merely helped it be undeniable. The second thing was the letter from America. It came from a professor at the University of Virginia, a man named Hargrove, whom she had never met, who had read the Edinburgh Review article and then somehow, through what network she couldn't imagine, obtained a copy of the committee's official record. His letter was 3 pages long and extremely direct. He said that he had been following the development of Western provincial Latin scholarship for 20 years, and that the grammatical analysis described in the committee record was the most precise work he had seen in the field in a decade. He asked if she would be willing to correspond. He asked if she had considered a formal academic position. He mentioned, in the 3rd paragraph, that the University of Virginia was in the process of expanding its classical studies program and was not, as he put it, entirely closed-minded about the question of who was qualified to teach. She read the letter 4 times. She put it in the drawer. She took it back out and read it again. She wrote back the same day. She was careful not to let her hands shake while she wrote. The third thing that happened was harder. She came back to the rooming house on a Wednesday evening to find Mrs. Aldrich waiting in the hall with an expression that had moved past sharp satisfaction into something more uncomfortable, something that might, in a different person, have been guilt. "I've had a request, Mrs. Aldrich said from several of my other tenants." Evelyn waited. "They've read the papers," Mrs. Aldrich said, "the articles about the situation. And they feel that the nature of your work and the attention it has attracted is not consistent with the character of this establishment." She looked at Mrs. Aldrich for a long moment. "You're asking me to leave, Mrs. Aldrich looked at the wall. "I'm asking you to consider whether alternative arrangements might be—" "How long do I have?" she said. Mrs. Aldrich's chin came up slightly. "Fine," she said, and went upstairs. She sat at her desk. She looked at the 3 books on the windowsill, the Virgil, the military text, the notebook. She thought about packing them again. Thought about the ship to London, the $11, the letter of introduction to a society that had never intended to hear her name. She thought, I am not going to cry about a rooming house. She did not cry. She wrote a letter to Alexander instead, telling him she needed to find new accommodation, and could he recommend a reputable establishment. And she sent it the same night. His reply came the next morning. It said, "There is a set of rooms in the east wing of Whitmore House that have been empty since my mother passed. They are not lavish. They have a desk, 2 windows, and access to the library, if you would consider it appropriate. They are available for as long as you require them. The choice is entirely yours." She read it. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. She thought about what it would mean. The newspapers, the articles about propriety, the questions about their arrangement. She thought about everything Fairfax had already put in print and everything he had yet to put in print and what adding lives at Whitmore House to the list of accusations would mean for her name. She thought about the paper 4 days from publication. She thought about Professor Hargrove's letter. She thought about the misconduct filing and the independent review and the long, slow process of being right in public when the world has decided it prefers you to be quiet. She thought, I have never once made a decision based on what would be most comfortable for my reputation. I'm not going to start now. She wrote back, I'll come Sunday. Thank you. She moved in on a gray Sunday morning with everything she owned in 2 cases. The East Wing rooms were exactly as described, not lavish. 2 windows, a desk, shelves along the walls that were empty and waiting. She set her 2 cases down. She unpacked the 3 books first, the way she always did, and put them on the windowsill. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Alexander appeared in the doorway. He looked at her, then at the 3 books on the windowsill. Then back at her. Virgil, he said, reading the spine. My father's copy. A Roman military text. And his notebook. She paused. He never finished the translations in it. He looked at the notebook for a moment. Will you finish them? She had not thought about it in those specific terms before, not as a task. Not as a project, but as a question with an answer she needed to give. She looked at the notebook. She thought about the last entry. The men who were forgotten living in the space between words. Yes, she said. He nodded. He moved back from the doorway. The library is at the end of the hall. You know where the workroom is. Breakfast is at 8, but there's no requirement to appear for it. He paused. Mrs. Howell manages the household. If you need anything, ask her. Thank you, she said. He was almost back into the hallway when she said, Alexander. He stopped. He turned back. It was the first time she had used his given name. She looked at him across the empty room, with the 2 cases on the floor, and the 3 books on the windowsill, and the gray London morning coming through the 2 windows. I know what this cost you, she said, having me here. What people will say. He looked at her for a long moment. I know what it cost you too, he said. I'm used to paying costs, she said. So am I, he said. And then quietly, you're not the only person in this house who has spent time being looked at and found wanting. Miss Hartwell. I was a second son in a family that only counted first son. I went to war because my father couldn't think of anything else to do with me. I came back to a dukedom I inherited by accident and a property claim that made me feel like I was standing on ground that might not actually be mine. He held her gaze. You found me the ground. The least I can do is provide you a place to stand. She didn't say anything. He nodded once and left. She stood in the middle of the room for another long moment. Then she opened the first case and started unpacking. The paper was published 6 weeks later in the Archaeological Review. The title was precise and formal, the way she had written it. A re-examination of the Dunmore manuscript, Provincial Latin in the 3rd century, and the documentary evidence of the Whitmore lineage. Under the title, in the standard format of the journal, the author's name, Evelyn Hartwell. No institutional affiliation listed. No degree cited, just her name on the page in print. She held the journal in the East Wing room, and she looked at her name for a long time. She looked at the way the letter sat on the page. Clean and permanent and real. She thought about the copying room in the basement of the society. She thought about her father's kitchen table. She thought about 11 corrections absorbed into someone else's authority without a trace. Not this time. She heard a knock at the door. Alexander came in without waiting for an answer. He had developed the habit and stopped when he saw her face. She was not crying, but it was close. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without saying anything. He looked at the journal in her hands. She turned it and held it so he could see the title page. He read it. He looked at her name. There it is, he said quietly. There it is, she said. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, London went about its business. Inside, something that had been moving toward this point for a very long time arrived. The Edinburgh Review has already requested a response piece, he said. Dawson is writing it. He told me it will be the most thorough endorsement he's written in 20 years. That will help, she said. Professor Hargrove wrote again. He's coming to London in the spring. He'd like to me, directly. Good. He paused. The Lord Chancellor's office settled the property claim this morning. In our favor. Another pause. Apparently a grammatically neutral error is a legally sufficient error. When the documentation is sufficiently robust. She looked at him. That's good news. It is. He looked at the journal again. Fairfax's misconduct review has been formally opened. 3 institutions are participating. He was quiet for a moment. You should know that your 11 corrections are the foundation of it. They are the thing that makes it unignorable. She thought about Fairfax sitting in the presentation hall while the room applauded. She thought about the color his face had gone. I don't want to destroy him, she said. Alexander looked at her. What do you want? She thought about it carefully. I want the 11 men whose names were in that casualty record to be listed correctly in the historical archive. I want the soldier's letter published in full, with appropriate context, in a way that treats him like a person rather than a historical curiosity. She paused. I want the next woman who walks into that building and finds an error to be able to say so out loud. He looked at her for a long moment. That's not a small thing. It's not. He stood up. He crossed the room and he stood in front of her desk. And she stood up too, because she was not a person who remained seated when there was something to meet directly. They stood across the desk from each other, and the journal was between them. Her name facing up. The Archaeological Review has asked if you'd consider a regular column, he said. Quarterly, on provincial Latin scholarship. Your own work. Your own name. Her breath caught. They asked me to pass along the invitation, he said. Because they weren't sure how to reach you directly. I told them that would change. Yes, she said, it will. He looked at her. She looked at him. The journal sat between them with her name on the cover, and the gray London afternoon coming through the 2 windows and the 3 books on the windowsill, and the whole long road that had led from a Virginia kitchen table to this room. Visible in the air between them if you knew how to look. Evelyn, he said. Yes. He stopped. He was not a man who started sentences he hadn't finished in his head. Which meant whatever he was about to say was something he hadn't been able to finish. Even privately, she waited. I would like to know you, he said. Not the scholar, not the translator, not the woman who walked into my presentation hall and dismantled everything I thought I knew about who was capable of what. He held her gaze. The person, if you're willing. She looked at him. She thought about his face in the committee room, sank absolutely still in the 3rd row. She thought about the chair by the window, in her rooming house. And food in a paper bag, and a man who had stayed until midnight, not because it was useful, but because she needed someone to stay. She thought about you're not the only person in this house who has spent time being looked at and found wanting. And the way he had said it without performance, without management. As simply and directly as he did everything when he stopped calculating and started meaning it. She thought, he is asking me a real question. She thought. I can give him a real answer. I'm willing, she said. He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, and she suspected he had not intended her to hear it. She pretended she hadn't. Good, she said. She picked up the journal. She looked at her name one more time. Then she set it down and said, now, I have a column to write. And you're distracting me. Something crossed his face that she was beginning to recognize, not quite amusement. But the thing that lived just next to it, the thing that happened when she surprised him. My apologies, he said. Accepted, she said. Close the door on your way out, he left. He closed the door. She sat down. She opened her father's notebook to the last unfinished entry. She picked up her pen. She began to finish what he had started. The column ran for the first time in March. She had written it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first version was too academic dense with footnotes, structured like a paper rather than an invitation. The second version overcorrected. It was readable but thin, and she knew it, and she threw it out. The third version she wrote at 2 in the morning, by lamplight, in the East Wing room, after she had stopped trying to write it the way she thought it should be written, and simply wrote it the way her father had taught her to explain things at the kitchen table. Direct, human, as if the person reading it mattered more than the person writing it. She sent it to the Archaeological Review without showing it to anyone first. 2 days later, the editor wrote back, "This is exactly what we wanted. When can we have the next one?" She wrote back, 3 months. "That's when I'll have something worth saying," he replied. "We'll hold the space." She put the letter in the drawer with the newspaper articles and Professor Hargrove's correspondence and the reply from the University of Virginia that had arrived the previous week, offering her a visiting lectureship for the following academic year. She had not yet answered that one. She was still turning it over. The way she turned over a difficult translation, looking at it from different angles. Waiting until she understood not just what it said but what it meant. Alexander did not ask her about it. She noticed that. He noticed things about her. She had become certain of that over the months of working alongside him, of eating breakfast in the same room, of spending evenings in the library with him reading at one end while she worked at the other, and he held most of what he noticed quietly. Without pressing, he had learned somehow that she made better decisions when no one was waiting for them. It was, she thought, a rare quality in anyone, rarer still in a man who had spent his entire adult life in positions that required him to make fast decisions and expect others to follow them. She was thinking about this on the morning that the second trouble arrived. And thinking about it was probably why she didn't see it coming. The letter was from Cambridge. Not from Reeves, the younger scholar who had presented alongside Fairfax at the committee hearing. From the institution itself, from the office of the Master of St. John's College, formal and heavy with implication. It informed her, in the specific language of people who choose their words to wound without being accountable for the wound, that the college was commissioning an independent scholarly response to her archaeological review paper. The response would be written by 3 senior members of the classics faculty. It would be published in the Cambridge Classical Journal within 60 days. She read it twice. She understood immediately what it was. Not a scholarly engagement those she welcomed. Those were how knowledge moved. This was something else. This was institutional muscle. This was Fairfax's 30 years of relationships making one last coordinated move before the misconduct review concluded and his leverage disappeared entirely. She walked down the hall to the library. Alexander was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, his jaw tightened one specific muscle, just below his ear that she had learned to read. 60 days, he said. The misconduct review concludes in 45. He set the letter down. He looked at her. They're trying to get something in print before Fairfax is formally censured. So the response to your paper exists in the record before his credibility is publicly compromised. Yes, she said. Which means whatever they publish will be cited as legitimate Cambridge scholarship. And his role in commissioning it will be buried. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, really think, the way he did when something mattered. The way she had watched him work through the legal implications of the property claim. What do you need? He said. I need to know who's writing it, she said. The 3 faculty members. I need their names and I need their published work. Why? Because if I know their arguments in advance, she said, I can have my response written before they publish. The moment their piece appears, mine appears alongside it. Same journal if possible. If not, the Archaeological Review. She paused. I won't let them have 60 days of unchallenged air. He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, not quite admiration. Something more precise than that. The specific look of a person watching someone else do something they are entirely built for. Pemberton has contacts at Cambridge, he said. I'll write to him today. Thank you, she said. She turned to leave. He said, Evelyn. She stopped. The Virginia offer, he said. The lectureship. She turned back. She looked at him across the library. I know you haven't answered it yet, he said. I know it's not my question to ask, he held her gaze. But I'd like you to know that whatever you decide, if you go, if you stay, if you do something else entirely, I will not make it harder than it already is. She stood in the doorway of the library and looked at him and thought about all the ways a person could say, I don't want you to leave, without saying it. Thought about whether she wanted him to say it directly, and whether it would change anything if he did. I know, she said. She went back to the East Wing, and she started reading Reeves's published work. Pemberton delivered the names within a week. 3 Cambridge classicists, all of them senior, all of them credentialed in ways that would look formidable in a journal heading. She read their published papers systematically, one after another, making notes, building a map of their arguments and their methods, and the specific places where their scholarship was strong, and the specific places where it was careful in the way that conceals weakness, rather than acknowledging it. She found what she was looking for in the second man's work. A paper published 4 years earlier on the standardization of Latin letter forms in the 2nd century. It was well regarded, it was frequently cited, and it contained an assumption about regional dialect variation that she could prove, using the Dunmore documents themselves, was incorrect. Not slightly incorrect, foundationally incorrect. The kind of incorrect that, if her response made it visible at the right moment, would undermine not just his argument about her paper, but his authority to make the argument at all. She worked for 3 weeks. She slept badly and ate irregularly and spent most of her waking hours either at her desk or in the library, pulling texts and cross-referencing and building the counter-argument the way she built everything from the inside out, starting with the hardest point, making the weakness the foundation. Alexander left food outside her door on the evening she forgot to appear for dinner. He did not comment on it. He did not make it an occasion. He simply left the tray and went back to whatever he was doing. And she found, somewhere around the 2nd week, that the quiet regularity of it had become something she oriented toward without meaning to. A fixed point in days that had very few of them. On the 22nd day, Dawson wrote to her. He had been contacted by the Cambridge Master's Office, he said, asked to comment on her paper before the response was published. He had declined to provide a comment and wanted her to know that he had declined. He also wanted her to know that 2 other independent scholars' names she recognized from the committee gallery had similarly declined. He wrote, There are more of us than they are counting on. Miss Hartwell, that is not nothing. She read the letter 3 times. She wrote back, It is not nothing at all, thank you. Professor Dawson. She put the letter in the drawer. She looked at the drawer. It was getting full the newspaper articles. Hargrove's letters, Dawson's notes, the Archaeological Review correspondence, the Virginia offer still unanswered in its cream-colored envelope. She thought about what it meant that her life had started filling up drawers in a room she hadn't expected to occupy. She thought about her father's kitchen table, about how full his margins always were. She went back to work. The Cambridge response was published on a Thursday. She read it that morning. Alexander had obtained an advance copy through Pemberton, which she had told him not to do, and was quietly grateful that he had done anyway. She read it in the East Wing room with her door closed and her tea getting cold and the 3 books on the windowsill watching her with whatever patience old books have. It was exactly what she had expected, precise, formal, and structured around the assumption that her grammatical analysis was the work of someone who had read widely but thought narrowly. It challenged her reading of the property record. It challenged her identification of the Western Provincial Register. It challenged, with particular emphasis, her claim that the emotional tone of the commander's letter was linguistically significant rather than interpretively convenient. It was well written. It was formidable. It was in 3 specific places she had already identified, built on the foundational error in the second author's 4-year-old paper. She picked up her pen. Her response was already written. She read it through one final time, made 2 small adjustments, and sent it to the Archaeological Review with a note to the editor for simultaneous publication if at all possible. You'll understand why when you read it. He wrote back by end of day, "We'll make it work." Her response appeared in print alongside the Cambridge piece within the week, in a supplementary issue of the Archaeological Review that the editor had apparently put together on extremely short notice. Because he was, as he wrote to her afterward, not interested in letting institutional muscle go unanswered in his journal. She did not celebrate. She sat in the East Wing room and she read both pieces side by side, looking for anything she had missed, any place where her argument had a gap that hadn't been filled. She found nothing, which did not mean there was nothing to find. Only that she had looked as hard as she knew how to look. Alexander knocked on her door at 7 in the evening. "The editor wrote," he said. "I know. He wrote to me too. Hargrove wrote as well. He's arriving in London next week. He'd like to meet." She looked up. "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. He came in and sat in the chair by the window, his chair. She had started thinking of it as his chair, which was something she noted and chose not to examine too closely. "You should feel something about this," he said. "What you just did." "I do feel something about it," she said. "What?" She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said. "And careful. Like I'm still waiting for the thing I haven't seen coming." He nodded slowly. "That's not the worst instinct. I know." She looked at the drawer with everything in it. "But I also stopped." She started again. "My father spent 40 years being right in rooms where no one was listening. I used to think that was a tragedy. Now I think it was preparation." She met his eyes. "I am going to finish his translations. I'm going to publish them. I'm going to teach at Virginia and come back and write the next column and fight whatever Cambridge sends next. And at some point," she paused, "at some point it's going to stop feeling like fighting and start feeling like just working. Doing the thing." He looked at her. "When does that happen?" "I don't know," she said. "But I think it happens." He was quiet for a moment. "The misconduct review concludes next week," he said. "Pemberton expects a formal censure. Fairfax will likely retain his position. He has too many allies for outright dismissal, but his ability to publish without scrutiny, to sit on review committees, to do the things that gave him the power to hurt you." He paused. "That ends." "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. "Good." She met Professor Hargrove the following Tuesday at a tea room near the Society Neutral Ground. She had suggested, and he had agreed readily, which told her he was someone who understood the significance of where a meeting happened. He was older than she had imagined from his letters in his 60s, with the particular energy of a man who had spent decades being interested in things and had not run out of things to be interested in. He stood when she came in, which she had not expected, and shook her hand with both of his, which she also had not expected. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I have been waiting to have this conversation for 3 months. Professor Hargrove," she said. "So have I." They sat, they ordered tea, and then they talked for 2.5 hours. And it was the closest thing to talking with her father she's experienced since Virginia, which she noted, and which cost her something she did not show. He talked about the field, where it was going. The questions that hadn't been asked yet, because the people positioned to ask them were too invested in the questions that had already been answered. He talked about the University of Virginia program, not as a sales pitch but as a genuine description of what existed and what was missing. He talked about students, specific students he worried about, and students who had surprised him, and students who were the reason he still did the thing after 40 years. She talked about the Dunmore documents, about her father's notebook, about the 11 corrections and what they had taught her. Not just about Fairfax, but about the infrastructure of knowledge, who builds it, who maintains it, who gets to decide what counts. At the end, he looked at her across the table and said, "The lectureship offer stands. But I want to ask you something first, and I want you to answer it honestly." "All right," she said. "Is London finished with you?" he said. "Or are you finished with London?" She thought about it. She thought about the East Wing room and the chair by the window, and the library at the end of the hall, and 3 books on the windowsill, and a man who left food outside her door on the nights she forgot to eat. She thought about the Archaeological Review column and Dawson's notes, and the Misconduct Review concluding next week. "Neither," she said. "I don't think it works that way." He nodded slowly. "Then come for a semester," he said. "See what it is. You can decide the rest from there." She looked at him. "And the work I'm doing here? Bring it with you. Finish it there, send it from there." He smiled. "Miss Hartwell, scholarship doesn't require you to stay in one place. It requires you to keep going." She thought about her father, who had never left Virginia and had done extraordinary work anyway. She thought about the Roman commander who had written his letter in the dark before the last battle and trusted it to travel. "I'll come for a semester," she said. He extended his hand across the table. She shook it, she told Alexander that evening. She found him in the library after dinner, where he usually was. She came in and sat across from him and said, without preamble, "I'm going to Virginia in the autumn, for 1 semester. I'll be back in the spring." He set down his book. He looked at her for a long time. She watched him process. It watched the careful machinery of him, working through what it meant and what it didn't mean and what he was going to say about it. 1 semester, he said. "Yes, and then back." He picked his book back up. He looked at the page. He set it back down. "The column," he said. "The Archaeological Review. I can write it from Virginia. Hargrove made that clear. Your father's translations. I'm taking them with me. I'll finish them there. It seems," she paused, "it seems appropriate." He nodded. He looked at the book without reading it. She waited. "I'm going to find it very quiet," he said finally. His voice was even, matter-of-fact, but she had learned to hear what lived underneath his matter-of-fact. "I know," she said. "That's not a reason for you not to go. I know that too," she said. "That's why I'm going." He looked up at her, and she saw it then fully. Without the management, without the calibration, the thing he had been carrying since the lamplight evenings and the food at the door. And you're not the only person in this house who has spent time being looked at and found wanting. She saw it clearly, and she did not look away from it. "Evelyn," he said. "Alexander," she said. The room was very quiet. "When you come back in the spring," he said, slowly. Carefully, like a man building an argument he is not sure will hold. "I would like to ask you something. A specific question. That I am not ready to ask yet." She looked at him across the library. She thought about the Roman brother, writing back in the only space left to him. She thought about her father's unfinished translations. Waiting in a notebook for someone with the right kind of patience. She thought, some things are worth waiting for. "I'll be here in the spring," she said. "Ask me then," he exhaled. She heard it this time and did not pretend otherwise. "Good," he said. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame the same way he had. Once, back at the beginning, when he had been about to say something he hadn't planned to say, and she turned back. "For what it's worth," she said. "I already know what I'll say." She left before he could answer. She sailed in September on a ship that smelled of salt water and coal smoke. The same as the one that had brought her. The 3 books were at the bottom of her case. Under her papers and her ink supply and her father's notebook with its pages, now crowded with her own handwriting. His translations finished, and hers begun, the 2 of them sharing the margins the way they had always shared everything he knew. Virginia in the fall was exactly as she remembered. The air had a quality she had forgotten about, cleaner than London. Quieter, carrying the particular smell of old leaves and cold coming. She stood outside the university building on her first morning, and she breathed it in, and she thought about a kitchen table and winter light and a man reading Virgil aloud while the morning came through the window. She thought, I'm here, Papa. Look where I got to. She went inside and she taught her first class. There were 14 students. 8 men, 6 women, the 6 women seated together near the back, with the posture of people who have learned to take up as little space as possible, who are waiting to find out whether this room is safe. She saw it immediately. She saw it because she had sat the same way once in the copying room in the basement of the Royal Historical Society. Her arms full of other people's work, she put her papers on the desk. She looked at the class. She said, my name is Evelyn Hartwell. Last year, I walked into a room full of the most credentialed scholars in England and translated a document they had failed to read for 3 weeks. They told me I couldn't do it. I did it anyway, she paused. That is not a story about me being exceptional. It is a story about what happens when you actually understand something, rather than simply knowing it. She looked at the 6 women near the back. I don't care where you sit. I care whether you're listening. Are you listening? They were. Good, she said. Then let's begin. She wrote to Alexander every week. Letters, real letters, not notes, not procedural communications. She told him about the students, specifically the ones who surprised her. She told him about finishing her father's translations. The last 3 entries she completed, sitting at a desk in Virginia with the fall light coming through a window that faced west. She told him about Hargrove, who turned out to be the kind of colleague she had not known she was missing until she had him. She told him about the second column, which ran in December to responses she had not anticipated, letters from women she had never met, in cities she had never been to, who wrote to the Archaeological Review to say that they had been waiting for someone to say the things she had said in the way she had said them. He wrote back every week. He told her about the property, the legal settlement fully concluded, the disputed land officially and permanently secured. He told her about the misconduct review Fairfax formally censured, 2 of his published translations officially retracted. His position on the Society's board quietly ended. He told her about the Whitmore Library, which he was having properly catalogued for the first time in its history, and the things that kept being found in it. He wrote, I think you should be here for this. There is no one else who would understand what some of these documents are. She wrote back, I know. I'll be there in the spring. He wrote, I know. She came back in April, on a ship that smelled of salt water and coal smoke. Alexander met her at the dock. She had not expected that. He was standing at the end of the gangway, not performing casualness, not pretending he happened to be there, just standing, watching for her, and when he saw her he did not wave or call out. He waited until she reached him. Welcome back, he said. Thank you, she said. He took the heavier of her 2 cases without asking. They walked. The city was different in the spring, less gray, less compressed, the air carrying something that almost felt like possibility. She looked at it as they walked and thought about the first time she had made this approach. $11 and a letter of introduction and no illusions. She had many fewer illusions now, and considerably more. They reached Whitmore House. He set her case down in the entrance hall. She stood in the entrance hall and looked around it, the familiar dimensions of it, the particular quality of the light, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 7 months. She looked at him. He looked at her. You said in the spring, he said. I did, she said. It's spring, it is. He took a breath. He was not a man who was nervous. Often she had seen him face legal proceedings and hostile scholars and rooms full of people who wanted him to fail without showing it. But he was showing it now, slightly, in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. And she found it more endearing than she had any practical use for. I would like to ask you, he said, whether you would consider whether it would be. He stopped. He looked at her directly. He started again, and this time the sentence was simple and unmanaged and entirely his. I would like you to stay, not as a scholar in the East Wing, not as a translator on commission, as he paused, as the person I want to have in this house, permanently, if you're willing. She looked at him. She thought about the Roman commander writing in the dark. She thought about the brother who wrote back, "I remember. I will not forget your name." She thought about her father's kitchen table, and a notebook full of margins, and the words translated like a human being written in pencil, so faint she'd had to tilt it toward the light to read. She thought about what her father would have said. She thought he would have said, "You found someone who sees you." "Evelyn, that is not nothing. That is not nothing at all." "I told you in the autumn," she said, "that I already knew what I'd say." "You did," he said. "You left before I could ask what it was." She looked at him. She let him see it, all of it, the 7 months of letters, and the students near the back of the class, and the finished translations and the column, and everything she had built, and everything she still intended to build. She let him see that none of it made her smaller, that all of it was what she was bringing. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." When people asked Evelyn Hartwell, which was how she was known, the name printed on papers and columns, and the introduction to her father's collected translations, published the year after she married and dedicated to Edmund Hartwell, who taught me to listen when people asked how it had started. She said it started with a letter, a Roman commander, writing to his brother in the dark before the last battle. Not because he expected to be remembered, because he needed someone to know that he had existed, that he had been afraid, that he had loved something enough to ask it to continue without him. She said, "The greatest discoveries are not always the ones we go looking for. Sometimes they are the ones that were already there, waiting in the silence between words, waiting for someone with the right kind of patience to hear them." She said, "My father taught me that." She said it at universities, and in the columns that ran quarterly for 20 years. And in the classroom, always the classroom, where she looked for the people sitting near the back with the posture of those waiting to find out whether the room was safe. And she looked at them directly, and she asked, "Are you listening?" They always were, and she always began, because that was what knowledge was. Finally, not a possession, not a credential, not a door that opened only for the people who already had keys. It was an act. A continuous, deliberate, courageous act of choosing to understand, and to say what you understood, and to refuse to be silent when silence was the easier and safer and lonelier road. Evelyn Hartwell had walked into a room full of powerful men with nothing but her father's voice in her memory and the truth in her hands. She had not asked permission. She had never needed to.